Tonight we also have Nadia Steinzor here. She's the Eastern Program Coordinator of the Oil and Gas Accountability Project at Earthworks, a national organization dedicated to protecting communities and the environment from the impacts of irresponsible mining and energy development. Nadia works with a growing movement of homeowners, concerned citizens, and organizations to educate and support impacted communities, advance state and oil, I'm not sure about this, and to promote federal reform. She has conducted research on the health impacts of shale gas development, and we'll talk about findings from Pennsylvania and other states and how they relate to our concerns about the AIM project and the New York gas build-out. Thanks, Nadia.
Thank you. This is quite an impressive microphone. I feel like I'm in a radio studio or something. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here tonight, and thank you for that kind introduction, Susan and everyone else who's hosting this, too many to list. I'm a New York resident. I live up in the Catskills, which theoretically is not going to get gas development, but as you are experiencing here, there are infrastructure issues to contend with everywhere, even when you're not necessarily fracked in the core sense of the word of drilling. And I'm not going to make you sit through a PowerPoint because Wilma is going to be covering a lot of the health stuff and all the good information. She and I have worked very closely together in many accounts, but I just was going to kind of give some context and a little bit of information as to why public health is not figuring in these decisions very well. And it may seem like an obvious thing to do, especially when we have all of our elected officials from Governor Cuomo on down saying this, all our decisions are going to be based on science and not emotion. Well, where's health? I mean, everybody's always talking about, well, of course health is so important. And I think, part of it is our regulatory system is set up to kind of permit one facility at a time, one allowable permit to pollute at a time. And nobody's really looking at it in a bigger picture, as Matt alluded to with aggregation. We'll talk about that as well. What happens when this spider web develops of pipelines, of compressor stations, of waste impoundment pits, and of course gas wells. And it's those kind of cumulative impacts, which is actually a regulatory term, cumulative impacts over time and space, that lead to public health problems. And without those kinds of analyses, it's really hard to say what the eventual public health impact of gas development is going to be. And probably this stems in part from the real mismatch in timing. Do any of you feel like you have whiplash in your community with this development coming? Like, hey, what happened? And maybe sort of, whoa, how'd that happen? Well, I think that's how a lot of communities around the country feel. Before they know it, the trucks are rolling up the road and the rigs are being put in, and suddenly there's this thing being dug next to me, and there was one comment period, and I heard about a hearing, sort of, kind of, and then all of a sudden the development's taking off. And so that kind of pattern is happening across the Marcellus Shale region long before most of us have time to figure out whether this is something we want. But what companies and their supporters have not bargained for is coming to the East, where things are really densely developed and where there's sort of more of a history, perhaps, of organizing around health and the environment. And people, like a lot of folks in this community and across Pennsylvania and certainly across New York, standing up and asking questions. And that is the most important thing, ask questions. How is this going to impact my air and water? Is that why we're here tonight, right? People are concerned. So this is a really big expansion, obviously. This is not just business as usual. I mean, I saw a map recently of all the pipelines in New York, and I was sort of stunned as a longtime New York resident. It's like, really? That's all here now? But what they're talking about now, as you heard from the other presentations, is adding on to that with a vast, vast expansion. And it can't be business as usual because we're in a time, non-attainment, that means that we're already pretty polluted. And we also are living in the era of climate change. So it cannot be business as usual, which is why, again, it's so important to question. But public health has not been a priority for policymakers in this whole process. New York has said they're going to look at the health impacts. We still don't really know what the extent of that is, and that mostly of their study, and that mostly pertains to drilling. Maryland, but the fact that health has even become part of the reason that the drilling is being held off is incredible progress. And any of you who wrote a comment in saying that we want a health impact assessment in New York, or spoke in favor of the moratorium bill, and even those of you who thought about it and didn't write should feel very proud, because this is actually a huge progress. To have health being talked about as a reason for holding up the drilling permits. But then you have situations like Maryland, Pennsylvania, and even the Department of Energy on the federal level that actually set up commissions to study the impacts of shale gas development. And there was there was one study done, looked at all of the commissions. Out of 50 experts on those commissions, on those 3 commissions, there was not a single public health expert. So that also says why we have pretty far to go. And then companies are simply not really required to provide information on the public health impacts. In this, the air quality permits are supposed to take into account public health impacts. But again, if we're not looking at the whole picture cumulatively, and companies are allowed to just get one permit at a time for one compressor station or one well at a time, and then all of a sudden it's a big spider web, or you have 7 wells on a pad, which is very common, 7 to 10 wells on a pad in Pennsylvania, it's a very different story than what you originally said when you went for the permit. So these are all the things we have to keep in mind, all the things we have to stay on top of. And only the reason we're all asking for an HIA, a health impact assessment, is because that kind of study, it's a system set up by the World Health Organization, actually will take into consideration what existing health conditions are. So whether you have impacted air quality here, or whether there's an area that's sitting on top of a toxic waste dump from the 50s, that would all be taken into account. And then, of course, I have to mention the 7 exemptions in our federal laws. Anybody heard of the Halliburton loophole here? Oh, whoa, okay, of course, that's the most famous one. But then there are 6 others: Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Superfund Law, even our National Environmental Policy Act has a special exemption for oil and gas to reduce public comment on certain types of projects. And some of those have actually been in place. They didn't all come about, they don't get fun names like the Halliburton loophole because they didn't all come about in the Cheney era. Many of them have been in place since the 80s. But those loopholes, most people think of them as allowing the industry to not play by the rules. But what it also really does from the public health perspective is it makes it very difficult to fully identify and calculate the impacts. Because if you don't have to count all of your facilities as one, which is the loophole in the Clean Air Act, how do you ever really get a handle on what the total emissions are? Because they're all being kind of parceled out and split apart. So how do we change this? And I hope I'm not going to sound pie in the sky and like I'm living in a fantasy world, because I actually live in a pretty cynical regulatory world. But we have to give public health a central role in decision making and really keep pushing. And that's, again, we have this opportunity in New York to really keep pushing for a moratorium on drilling until we get a health impact assessment. And I think there's room within your fights to also ask for that the public health discussion be part of the permitting process. And then we need to, over time, really force agencies like the DEC to plan and pace their permits. And I know that, in some cases, maybe not issue them at all. If you can't figure this out and you can't prove or guarantee that health will not be negatively impacted, maybe we shouldn't be issuing the permits. And that sounds like a no-brainer, but from a regulatory agency's perspective, it's a pretty hard thing to get your mind around. So we have to keep asking for that. Again, it often seems like we're just postponing the inevitable transition to conservation and efficiency and clean energy. And so the more we can, I was thinking this morning, I wonder this whole analogy of a spider web of infrastructure with these pipelines and these compressor stations being fairly unplanned as to where it's all going. And does anybody know if spiders actually plan out their web? Like, do they have a plan ahead of time, or do they just go and go and go? So I don't know, I thought that, I thought of that that is essentially the problem here. So because this transition is inevitable, the more we can slow things down and the more we can delay these big decisions on expanding the spider web, the more we'll have time to take the measures and really plan to protect public health. And when you're going to hear from Wilma about the public health impacts, I'll just say very quickly that all of the science that's emerging now, including our health survey and air testing project in Pennsylvania, and there's some copies of the report back there, are all pointing in the same direction, that there are clear associations between living near compressor stations and gas wells and health symptoms that people develop. So whether it's a community health survey or a peer-reviewed, multi-year academic study, they're all kind of pointing in the same direction. So keep asking questions, and thanks so much for having me, and I'll stop there.